So in our look back at the history of Toho Toku theater, we're going to take a bit of a side route here, even though it isn't fully a side route, and discuss a movie called Frankenstein Conquers the World, otherwise known as Frankenstein versus Baragon, or Frankenstein versus Subterranean Monster Baragon. This movie, it is a monster film, it is a kaiju film, it just doesn't have any kind of place in the Godzilla universe of monsters. There's no King Ghidorah, there's no Rodan, there's no Mothra, there's no Godzilla. It's like a side story, so I want to discuss it. Now, with that being said, yes, it is a different film, and I want to talk about it because it does have some of the same players. Ishiro Honda directs it, the same guy who directed many Godzilla films. Eiji Tsuburaya does the special effects like he did with many of the early Godzilla films. And on top of that, you've also got music by Akira Ifukube. So that trio is back once again for this movie. So I feel like it might not be a film in the Godzilla universe, but I think it's definitely a Showa film that's spiritually related to the Godzilla films. Now, this movie is a co-production. It's not just Toho. It was also co-produced with American International Pictures, and I believe Universal as well, because Universal, I think, had the rights to Frankenstein. But, however, the origin of this movie is rooted in Godzilla, because way back before this film was made, Tomoyuki Tanaka, the producer at Toho, big shot over there, really a big mover and shaker in the history of Godzilla, he commissioned a movie called Frankenstein versus the Human Vapor. And then later on, they were going to make a film called King Kong Meets Frankenstein, which wound up being reused as King Kong versus Godzilla, which is why in that film, King Kong gets electrocuted and he wakes up. King Kong did not have those powers in the original 1930s King Kong film. That was something they came up with because it was written for Frankenstein. Now, why they didn't change that, I couldn't give you an answer. I talked about that in my King Kong vs. Godzilla review. But this movie is co-produced, and there's actually two different cuts of this movie. Now, for the purposes of this film, I watched the Japanese theatrical version. That's the one that I watched. The U.S. version, which I think is called Frankenstein versus the Giant Devilfish, that one I have, but I have not watched it yet. And it is sort of it's not the only film in this, I guess in this timeline or in this franchise or whatever, because it does have a sequel called War of the Gargantuous, that's a separate Toho film, but once again, it still has the same producers, the same crew, the trio. There's some things about this film. First of all, much like Godzilla, this movie is absolutely rooted in the events of World War II. The first part of this film is a flashback to World War II. It's very interesting because the Japanese people, the Japanese culture was so incredibly affected. And obviously it wasn't the only culture. The whole world was affected. But Japan in particular, the Japanese people were very much affected by what happened in World War II, specifically the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And many people died. And it's an event that many older Japanese people still have heard of. Some lived it. I don't know if many people who were around back then are still alive now. Definitely not ones in those cities because that was terrible. But it's something that shaped Japanese politics, Japanese culture, and Japan as a whole. And once again, that comes into play in this film. We actually see early in the film, it starts off with a flashback of World War II. We see the atomic bomb. And that's what actually sets the course in motion for these monsters to come out, these mutations, so to speak. But, of course, it's tied in with Germany and Frankenstein's monster. So, basically, they took this idea of Frankenstein's monster from the original Mary Shelley story and kind of twisted it and kind of made their own version for this film. And he ends up being a character that's somewhat like King Kong. There's a lot of similarities to King Kong and also the Mothra film, the first one, because he is somewhat persecuted by humans. He's sought after by humans. You have your good humans and your bad humans. And we find out that basically, because at the beginning of the movie they show like Frankenstein's heart, and they talk about how Dr. Frankenstein used the heart, and that heart, mutated from the Hiroshima thing. So like, it was like sort of like the nuclear bomb kind of took Frankenstein's heart, the Frankenstein's monster's heart, and kind of turned it into this new creature. And then of course we have Baragon, who is his enemy. Now, as the film progresses, we see the boy mutate. This is kind of like what happened with Shin Gojira, where he's kind of getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the film goes on, to eventually, of course, become giant-sized, and that would eventually lead to a battle with Baragon. Now, I want to say a few other things. So this movie, unlike a lot of other Toho films, the main character of this film is not a Japanese actor. His name is Nick Adams, and he plays a character called Dr. James Bowen, and he's like the main character, him and his wife, and basically they're the good guys. They're the ones that actually kind of care about Frankenstein and, all that stuff. But, the thing is, the Frankenstein character, like the adult one's played by Koji Furuhata, and the kid version is Sumio Nakao, because he's growing and growing, as time goes by. But one thing I want to talk about with this movie is, as much as Eiji Tsuburaya's effects got better, there are some things in this movie that I think are a bit of a step down from other ones. First of all, the dubbing, okay? We've talked about this before, but it's really prevalent here. There's a lot of non-Japanese actors in this movie who are blatantly talking English. You can read like their lips and it matches up with the subtitles, but they are dubbed over by Japanese actors. And again, I find it very ironic that the US dubs of the Godzilla films are comically made fun of because of how the mouth flaps don't fit. They don't fit. And they can't. It's a different language. Here we have the same thing, but in reverse. You have non-Japanese actors who are playing characters that speak fluent Japanese, but they're being dubbed over by Japanese actors. And it's so obvious. Like, it's so obvious. You know what I mean? There's a scientist in the film, Dr. Reisendorf. He's the one that kind of does the research here. He's also played by Peter Mann plays him, but he's dubbed over by a Japanese voice actor. Also, even though I've been praising Eiji Tsuburaya's stunt work and his effects work, and it's great here, there are some really odd edits. Now, I'm not sure if this is Tsuburaya or if it's, and no disrespect, Ishiro Honda, but there are some parts during the Frankenstein Baragon fight that just don't look very good, man. The editing is wonky. Like, you see Baragon charge Frankenstein, and he kind of, like, it cuts to a different scene of him, and it's like, this kind of stuff, like, sometimes you can see these edits, but, like, sometimes you can note these edits if you have a good eye for it in future Japanese tokusatsu films and TV shows, but in this case, you don't even have to have a good eye for it. Like, it's blatant. You see the editing, like, it makes the movie, it sort of suspends the realism of the film and kind of takes you out of it. Like, you see the awkward cuts, and, it's just, it feels like there were a lot of, maybe rushed, maybe it was like poorly, maybe poorly cut together, it was rushed. It definitely felt like a step down when it comes to directing from Ishiro Honda's previous work. I mean, it really does feel like a step down. Maybe his heart wasn't in it. Maybe he was more focused on Godzilla, but that's a con. The pro is that the fight between Frankenstein and Baragon is a lot of fun to watch. I really enjoy watching that fight. Having an actor in his regular body, not in a giant suit, which is what Frankenstein was like in this movie. He has a face thing, like to make his head bigger and his features larger, but he's not in a giant monster suit like Godzilla, King Kong, Ghidorah, etc. Baragon is, but having a human, like just a regular human being wearing very little clothing, right? Just a regular, like, Tarzan jungle kind of guy fighting a dinosaur or whatever, really helps because the punches look better, he can move faster. He's not limited by the confines of a costume, and that really helped the fight feel faster and more exciting and more intense. that is a pro, of this movie. And the fight's good. Like I said, the fight's good. And I really like sort of like this caveman versus dinosaurs dynamic you see in this movie. Like clearly, that was kind of the idea. You have this caveman Frankenstein who acts like a caveman, looks like one, fighting this giant monster Baragon. So the thing is about this film, my overall thoughts. If you've been watching my reviews here on the channel, you already know that I have this thing that I say here that a lot of other people on YouTube and reviewers don't ever say, and that's called one and done, which is when you see a movie and you don't hate the movie. You think it's an okay movie, it's good, not a bad film, but it's what I call a one and done, which means you watch it once, you really don't have to watch it again for a long time. Now, there's movies that I love so much that I can watch a billion times. Pulp Fiction, the Star Wars trilogy, the Lord of the Rings movies, Back to the Future, all the classics. Some of you guys have your favorites, The Matrix, all classic movies you can watch at any point. Indiana Jones. There's also movies that, while they don't suck, they're not bad movies. This is not a poor movie. Some of it's kind of boring, but it's not a bad movie. It's just not one that I'm going to go back and see again. Like, not for a long time. 10 years, 20 years, or even longer. It's a film that I think people should probably take the time to watch once and never again. But if all you really want is Godzilla type stuff and you're really focused on that story, maybe the best thing to do is get a copy of the film and maybe watch like the last 20 minutes of the fight if you just want to see that, and then kind of put it away. Because the story is okay, but it does borrow a lot from King Kong and from Mothra, except that it's a human character or a humanoid Frankenstein's monster. There's obviously that whole tragic, he's a freak of nature type of thing, that's all in play. And the actor can emote a lot better than a monster in a cartoon, in a costume, and that's good. These are all good things, but overall, the film, while not a bad film, it's a one and done for me. I might see it again. I'm not saying I'm never going to see it again, but these kind of movies I tend not to revisit too frequently, and that's kind of how I feel about it. And it's a weird sort of rating because it doesn't mean it sucks. I guess you can call it average if you want to use that word, or mediocre, or whatever word you want to use. But I like to use the word one and done because it means the movie's worth watching, but probably not worth revisiting more than once. That's kind of my thoughts on it. So that's it. Frankenstein versus Baragon, or many names, Frankenstein versus Subterranean Monster Baragon. It does have an alternate cut, an alternate ending, and I may end up at some point watching that, but right now I want to move on to the next thing. So that is it for Toho's Toku Theater. If you haven't heard about this movie, try it at least once, especially if you're into kaiju, because it is a pretty decent kaiju fight. I like it a lot, the fight that is. And that's it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.